really know who Jim Cornette was until I was about 8 years old. Mind you, keep in mind, my wrestling fan, I'm still pretty young at this point. And 91 was the year I really became a huge wrestling fan. Like, I'd already been watching it since 87 when I was 4 years old, but this is when I really got into wrestling, became like a diehard. And I didn't even, it wasn't even on TV. I was watching WCW by spring of 91, but he was gone by late 1990. So my first exposure to him was reading the after mags, if you will, Pro Wrestling Illustrated. Because, okay, so my mom, my dad would usually get me wrestling magazine, WWF magazine, pretty much every month at this point. And but they never really give me the other wrestling magazines. Occasionally they give me WCW. But it was my grandmother, actually. She worked at the Go Transit Terminal here in Hamilton, the old one, the original one, not the one that's there now. The one near Rebecca Street area where the soup truck used to stop and whatnot. She worked there, and sometimes she, because again, grandmother's was buying treats, so she always did for me, and she'd get me a wrestling magazine, and they sold PWI there. I don't actually think they sold PWI at the Delicios Market, which was actually the store we would frequent to buy stuff and whatnot. And she get me the Pro Wrestling Illustrated stuff, and I remember reading about Smoky Mountain Wrestling. I remember I loved this magazine because it used to give me like the inside track, if you will, on wrestling. Because, and again, I'm not a dirt sheet reader at this point, you know what I mean? I'm not anything. It's just, I'm reading all these promotions that my friends and my cousins don't know about. You know what I mean? So it's just, and I like to read them too. Even as a young kid, I like to read the articles. I couldn't understand almost everything yet, because again, I'm 8. But I remember trying to read a lot, and I remember reading about this Cornette guy in Smoky Mountain Wrestling. That's when it was in its infancy still. And I'm like, wow, this guy's a jerk. And I remember that, and then now fast forward to 93. So he comes into the WWF. Now, we didn't get Raw in 93. As a matter of fact, we didn't get Raw in this area, in the Hamilton area, till 95 when TSN started airing it on Wednesdays. And then I remember switching to Tuesdays. We didn't even get Raw live up here until 98, until the Attitude Era was really taken off. But anyway, I digress. So they would recap segments from Raw on the recap shows that would air on like our local station here, CHH Channel 11. And I remember seeing this, and Heenan goes nuts over this guy coming to the ring. I'm like, who is this dork? And I'm coming in wearing a polyester suit, glasses and whatnot, and thinking, he looks familiar. And then Heenan refers to him, Jim Cornette. I'm like, that name's definitely familiar. So I go to my stash of magazines, and I'm thinking, and right away, and I specifically looked at Pro Wrestling Illustrated, and I found an issue regarding Cornette. And I'm like, oh, it's him. Yeah. Now, I remember watching being intrigued and thinking, okay, this guy's in WWF now. And I remember seeing my cousins, I think, that same day, as a matter of fact. So I remember watching that on my in my attic room on Clyde Street. It was on a Saturday. I usually watch those recap shows even because they aired a few hours after Superstar sometimes. On Saturday, I would go to my cousin's place, and I remember I think it was my cousin Wayne, who's about 2 years younger than me. He asked me, "Who's this Cornette guy?" I'm like, "Oh," and again, having the inside track, right? Because of the magazines I bought, like those bought for me. I said, oh, he's this manager from like some company in South USA called Smoky Mountain. And he's like, oh, I never heard of him. I'm like, oh, I read about him in the magazine. Like, that's all I'm saying, right? But then I pointed out, and I realized this too, even as a kid, that, well, if Bobby Heenan thinks he's a big deal, because we knew Bobby Heenan's success, because we knew all about Bobby Heenan at that point. And I remember watching him manage Yokozuna in the Heavenly Bodies and like thinking, I hate this guy. Which, again, that was the beauty of him. It wasn't what the heat is today. Oh, he's overrated. I hate him. He's overrated. And he's irrelevant. That's not a great buzzword, eh? But he's a great mouthpiece for Yokozuna. Again, the whole Camp Cornette faction, Vader, Owen, Bulldog, and Owen was great on the mic himself, and Bulldog wasn't too bad sometimes either. But it was like kind of like the Heenan-Bockwinkel dynamic, where they complemented each other. You know what I mean? And yeah, even Vader wasn't half bad on the mic. And They still complimented each other. So I remember really hating him, but enjoying hating him. Like, it was watching heels back then. And I loved it every time like someone would pop him in the mouth. It was great. I remember cheering in my living room on Clyde Street when WrestleMania 10, Piper, who was a guest referee for that Bret Hart Yokozuna match, knocked Cornette a good one. And which I remember myself and my cousin Mike, we both cheered at that. So I remember Cornette disappeared from TV in early '97. Now, I didn't know back then that he was working on creative. But I remember having a conversation shortly after he was taken off TV. It was in grade 8 with my good buddy John Forjak back then, and we were talking about great managers, how we hated them, but we loved watching them, like Jimmy Hart, Bobby Heenan. I think we maybe mentioned Slick, Paul Heyman, or Paulie Dangerously as he was known. And I remember John asked me, "What happened to that guy?" And of course, inside track, right? I said, "Oh, he's in a company called ECW." And John's like, "Oh, what's that?" I explained to him what ECW was. Well, he got to know ECW quite a bit as time went on as well. But so no, we're talking about great managers, and I said to him, "I gotta miss Cornette." He's like, "Oh yeah, Cornette was cool, like, you know, that sort of stuff, right?" And then Cornette popped up on TV again, late '97. I remember it was Cornette's commentary, and he started he started actually doing commentary on the first hour of Raw, but he was also doing these like editorials, sort of. And I remember the first one, I'm just kind of like, "Oh, lighten up." And when he criticized the NWO skit making fun of the Four Horsemen, Arn Anderson's retirement, especially targeting Kevin Nash for playing Arn and mocking him, whatever. But even Nash has addressed this on several occasions, saying how it wasn't even an issue when it first happened, it just suddenly became one. So, and I can understand, that's Cornette just sticking up for his buddies. I mean, by this point I'd learned more about Cornette's career prior. I knew that he was a big-time manager in the NWA, Crockett Promotions, because this was just shortly around the time of my tape trading days. And the other two, though, the next two, I remember after that, were the Phil Mushnick promos. And Phil Mushnick, who's living proof that you can be completely ignorant and make a lot of money still. A New York Post, need I say more? But yeah, and telling about, again, cutting promos on Mushnick about what he said about wrestlers in general, wrestling, and his crusade against it, and Brian Pillman's death that had recently happened. And Brian Pillman was one of my favorites, and I was pissed off, and Cornette got me riled up for that one. But the best one is when he criticized Halloween Havoc '97, that cage match with Hogan and Piper, which was abysmal, and I even thought so back then. And that Halloween Havoc '97 pay-per-view is one of my favorites. And I love WCW at this time. Still love WCW at this time. But I was sick of it. Like, sick of the Hogan's, and a few months later, Hogan Savage shooting again. Like, oh, come on. And these are guys I grew up, like, in my childhood, loving. But I don't think I appreciated them as much as the people a few years older than I was. You know what I mean? Because they liked watching these guys again. And I was in the minority, clearly, on that, because all those pay-per-views drew big numbers, but at the same time, I think that would become a problem long-term for WCW. But either way, so I remember, like, it was like, Cornette, like, I'm right behind, like, wow, Jim Cornette's cool. And then he's right. And I'm like, that match was terrible. And then the whole, who the icon in wrestling is, and that whole spiel in that same promo too. It's like, he's right. I said that. I remember saying that. I remember we talked about that promo with John. I remember I was in grade 9 at that point, just started grade 9 with John, and it was I remember that took place during the strike, the teacher strike that took place in October of '97. And I remember because I was calling John a lot, and we hung out a few times, and I remember that. Did you see what Cornette? That's one of the things we were talking about from that Raw. See what Cornette said? And he's like, yeah. He's like, we thought it was the coolest thing, and he's like. And we were like, we respect Hogan. Like, I remember the exact words we said to each other. Well, we respect Hogan and Piper and everything they'd done, but I don't want to see that crap anymore. Pretty much how we felt. Then he did one more Cornette commentary later that year. I remember it was just before that NWA faction was formed. Oh, that was great, wasn't it? Yeah. But it was still a great promo talking about, like, again, you're talking to a guy who's a fan of the Attitude Era, who I thought the good still far outweighed the bad at this point, and in a lot of ways still does. But he raised some good points about wanting to see wrestling, real wrestlers. You know, it was a great. It's all on YouTube. You gotta check it out. They're all great promos. But the way he just went off about him, like, I love this guy's dedication, passion, and love for professional wrestling. Little did I know, because again, I'm in about my tape trading days here. I watched stuff with him in Crockett. I got my hands on Smoky Mountain footage. And I'm thinking, this is incredible. He's better than I thought. He really is. And I even said this, and Bobby Heenan is my idol. He's just as good as Heenan. I became a huge Cornette fan in my tape trading days. And I'm thinking, why isn't he still managing? Little did I know, like I said, I found out later on, obviously, that he had other jobs that he was doing, working on creative, and he was still doing commentary sometimes. And then later I found out he was in OVW, and at that point I was reading like dirt sheet stuff and whatnot. So I did know about him being in OVW. I knew about the fight with Santino that led to his departure, but I still followed Cornette for years afterwards. And then I got my hands on a lot of his shoot interviews when he started doing more of them, like the 2000s and whatnot. I thought those were great. I'm like, again, I just love this guy's dedication to wrestling. So now we fast forward to today. You know, he's been officially in the business for 40 years. He's been involved one way or another for maybe a little more than that, maybe 45, 46 years, because he was, as a teenager, he was a photographer at ringside. And he's been watching it most of his life. And he's 61 now, I believe. He just had a birthday, so he's 61. So most of his life, that's a lot of knowledge in wrestling. And I'm going to flat out say this right here, right now. I like Jim Cornette. I do. Do I agree with everything he says? No. There's times I've actually vehemently disagreed with some of his thoughts and opinions. But yet, I think at the same time, considering what he has done, what he has accomplished, what, he has been through, he has a right to think this way. Even if you don't like it or if you don't agree with it, you don't have to like Jim Cornette. You don't have to, but I find what a lot of the vile dislike for him comes from, and again, this is just what I'm seeing on my own, but I've had others who have agreed with me on this. It's simply because when it comes down to at the end of the day, he doesn't like my favorite wrestler. What does Cornette know? He's irrelevant. Again, that buzzword that these toxic wrestling fans use these days, one of many. I'm like, well, if he's so irrelevant, then why are you talking about it? If something's irrelevant, you don't even really think about it. That's how I see irrelevancy. It's like he's trying to stay relevant. I'm like, well, he doesn't have to try. His podcast is doing extremely well. Even Eric Bischoff once said on 83 Weeks, and this is one of the reasons I don't listen to Bischoff's podcast anymore, is that he says that Cornette has this niche audience, this cult following. Again, he calls it the cult of Cornette, which Bischoff's partly right, but a small audience on this podcast. Cornette's podcast is one of the top wrestling podcasts in all the world. Bischoff's is barely cracking the top 20, and sometimes it's much lower than that. So Cornette has a much larger audience for his podcast than Bischoff, so he must be doing something right. I think Cornette has that, and I'll even say this too, I think Cornette has that Howard Stern effect. Remember the movie Private Parts with, again, about Howard Stern, where Stern plays himself, and Pig Vomit, Paul Giamatti, his character, is talking to one of the executives at WNBC. Gotta watch that movie again. And he's saying, the people that hate Stern listen to him more than the ones who like him. And the reason given was both the same. I want to hear what he's going to say next. I want to see what he's going to do next or whatever. I think a lot of people who hate Cornette listen to him because of that very reason. Because they can complain about something the next day. And again, a lot of people's gripes with Cornette and why they don't like him are valid. But I do. And again, Cornette has been proven right very often, and people can't stand that. And again, they'll look for now they'll just dig for reasons and reach for any reasons to hate him. It's the same thing with CM Punk. They'll just dig for anything. They can't just stick to what's out there. They got to dig for more because they got to make their narrative sound better. And it's, what is it? It's, when he called Penelope Ford, who I happen to like, Penelope Pit Stop, people thought Cornette was referring to as some kind of horror or whatever. Meanwhile, he was actually referring to an old Hanna-Barbera cartoon character. Wacky Races. I know people won't understand the reference. I get that. It's an old show. But at first I didn't clue in. But even though Penelope Pit Stop, why is that stuff? And then I looked it up, though. I did research, you see. I'm like, oh, yeah. Like, because I've never seen that cartoon a lot as a kid. Or they show reruns of it. And it was an older one from the 60s and 70s, I believe. But still, I remember seeing it. And yeah, that's all it was. And then he later explained that. Even recently, very recently, people, again, because he criticized Athena, again, who I like, about a recent match he had with someone who I've actually met on several occasions, Jody Threat, on a recent episode of AEW. And from what I've seen from what Jody's posting, I follow her on social media, she's had nothing but positive things to say about the experience. But these people come at Cornette thinking that he's after Athena because she's black. What? Or they feel he attacked Sonny Kiss because Sonny's gay. Again, no. If you actually listen to what he's saying, he's criticizing their performance, not who they are, not their orientation or their race. And to me, that just gets annoying. And of course, there's he doesn't like deathmatch wrestling, obviously. And you know what? To be honest with you, I think deathmatch wrestling, if done in certain ways, I've been a fan of some deathmatch stuff, but I'm not a diehard, and I can see why people don't like it. And there's some stuff I don't like GCW. I'm going to say that right now. I'm going to piss a lot of people off on my Facebook and people that I'm actually very well acquainted with. But you know what? I don't like GCW. I think it's garbage. I never really liked CZW that much. It had its moments. CZW at least has had its moments. Even GCW a time or two has. But again, that's just how I feel about it. Again, I'm not saying... And again, here's the thing. I'm not saying you can't like it. I'm not saying you're wrong for liking it. Cornette might. And I think that's where he takes things a little too far sometimes. But I do not believe for a second that you're wrong for liking anything wrestling related. Because that's just how wrestling is in the modern era. You know what I mean? It's perfectly fine if you like it. Me personally, it just doesn't do anything for me as a fan. The CCW never did. I like ECW because it had a different way of approaching that style of wrestling. And it had great storytelling, had some really classic matches and moments and whatnot. And even Cornette hated ECW too. He hated that. But he understood at least Heyman's vision and, understood that why that style of wrestling or why ECW was, had its following. He's acknowledged that on several occasions if he doesn't necessarily like it. But again, this is more the venom and hatred towards Cornette. It's the same old stuff. Oh, he's a cuck because of his sex life. Again, that came under scrutiny over some story that happened a couple years ago, and which ended up being really nothing. They thought, Cornette's finally going. They were just chomping at the bit for him to fall and be canceled or whatever, and it never happened. And yet, that's all they'll say. Jim Cook, yeah, like, wow, that's clever. It's like CM Puke or CM Junk, like, grow up. But, yeah, and it's just like, it's what it comes down to. Oh, he doesn't like the wrestlers I like. He doesn't like the style of wrestling I like. Well, he's irrelevant. Like, well, you're keeping him relevant by talking about him. Don't talk about him if he's so relevant. Yeah, but I'm a fan. I'm a fan of Jim Cornette. Again, I think, takes a lot to art. Is some of it a work? Nah, I don't think his opinions are. I think the way he might go about them is a little more of that the old school manager side of him. But here's a guy who's been a booker. Okay, so obviously he's been a manager for many years. He's been a photographer, been a booker. He's worked in many different capacities. He's run his own promotion. He has done a lot. He has again, but people again will be like, oh well. His own promotion, he couldn't keep it alive. Well, again, yes, that's true, but it was in an era where wrestling in general was not doing well. It shut down probably one of the worst years in wrestling history in 1995. The Ring of Honor, he ruined Ring of Honor. Ring of Honor, I'll admit, during Cornette's regime wasn't the best. It was far from the best, actually, but it wasn't bad. And he was instrumental in their exposure that led to kind of the Sinclair Broadcasting deal, which again gave Ring of Honor more exposure on television. And again, OVW, again, working in developmental. He's done so much. And oh yeah, but he was fired from this job. Well, what have you accomplished? He's been there at least and lasted. There have been times he's been fired. There have been times he's been let go. There are times where he's quit. But he keeps getting hired. Oh, nobody's in a rush to hire him. That's not necessarily true. If again, there have been, in Cornette, there seems to be claims that, again, companies have wanted him to still work for him, but he chooses not to. But nobody's refuted these claims yet, so I have no reason not to leave him until they're refuted. Cornette's still sought after, and he's still popular because of his podcast, which is doing really well. Here's another thing, too. There's a reason why the man, and he's even said this, I think he said all but 2 or 3 years in his time in professional wrestling that he's been actively involved in the last 40 years, where there's only been like 2 or 3, I can't remember, he said there's 2 or 3 years he didn't make 6 figures. And that's to this day. That's like to now. Because he's still selling stuff online. He's still, again, like I said, podcast, everything. And I think that's also draws the ire of people that he's so successful at it. And I get it. And again, like I said, you don't like him, you don't like him. Don't listen to him. Don't pay him any attention. Don't make him relevant. Because by calling him irrelevant, you're just making him relevant because you're posting about it. You're bringing attention to him. There is like, I'll go on YouTube here and rant about things I don't like. But I won't sit here and say, oh, they're irrelevant, and then just keep talking about them. No, clearly it is relevant. CM Punk is relevant, even if you don't like him. Jim Cornette is relevant, even if you don't like him. It's like anybody. Roman Reigns. Even people try to call him irrelevant. Oh, there's one post I saw. He turned heel to stay relevant. I can just feel my IQ points dropping just reading that. Jericho's trying to stay relevant, this and that. I'm like, well, again, you're watching him every week. He's got to stay relevant. Either way. So, yeah. The way I see it, Jim Cornette, he has a wealth of knowledge that you can really learn a lot from. And that's why I still listen to him every week.